All right. All right. We'll now begin with, today we'll be talking about the rural agrarian one and also looking at the transformation, so that you will be covering the second paper not only in terms of part B, from where the basic understanding of the peasantry, village and the sociological understanding has to be developed by you. But we also need to look at the transformation that will basically be making you to go to the part C, unit 2, within which the questions have been there, either from the Green Revolution and the social consequences, such kind of questions are there. Land reform, very less questions I am finding on that one. Changing mode of Indian agriculture is the one through which the certain sociological perspective which has been developed, that has to be brought. From here the topics would be taking not much time, and more or less in a second paper, basically I always believe that second paper works like a mathematics. And when I say it works like a mathematics, in the sense that says second paper requires certain demands. The first and foremost is that you should be very clear that how the theoretical conceptual dimension which you have developed and become very clear in a paper 1 are to be used in a second paper. That extension has to be understood by you. And I have always been saying that when we talk about the Indian sociology and we compare that one with the Western sociology, from where we started looking at the emergence of sociology and the certain institutionalization, we should not forget that from 1919 to 1920, from where the sociology department came out in Mumbai, Bombay, then now it is Mumbai, almost 104 years have gone by. And in this 104 years, the theoretical conceptual dimensions have also been propagated, developed and established in Indian sociology. Such theoretical perspectives are to be used in your answer in a second paper. Broadly, when we are looking at the second paper, you need to know the structuralism or a structuralist approach in which Louis Dumont would be coming out, a structural functionist approach within which he will be talking about M.N. Srinivas and Andre Bete, a structural Marxist approach within which we will be talking about the two Mukherjees and the two Desais. And then you have also to talk about the modernistic perspective, within which Yogendra Singh questions comes out, in which you will be looking at the modernization of Indian tradition and other some theoretical dimensions or debates will be coming out. Subaltern perspective of Ranjit Guha, that is another one through which we will be finding about the new perspective to look at the Indian society in the different facets of the Indian society. An ideological approach, which was the oldest one, in which G.S. Guri and others will be coming out. It means your understanding of ideological approach, a structuralist approach, a structural functionist approach, a structural Marxist approach, modernistic approach and subalternist approach. You just give one reading and try to mentally make up that what are the major propositions of these 6 theoretical perspectives in India, and look at the nature of questions, try to bring them. Once you have known how to bring the theoretical conceptual clarity of the first paper to the second paper, and then looking at the theoretical perspectives and the concepts developed in Indian sociology, then one of the most important dimensions is that how you are going to substantiate your view with the empirical examples. Almost every unit which has been there in the second paper, the empirical examples are to be used by you to supplement your answer, not to frame your answers. And then you should be a bit analytical. And your answer should always be in a linear kind of perspective. These are the certain requirements of the second paper. And believe me dear, I am quite sure that you have gone through this and that your understanding of the second paper is there. Now in the today's class we are talking about the rural agrarian society basically. At least one dimension that has to be known to us that the two branches of social science, that is sociology and social anthropology, who claim to represent the study of the rural agrarian society, in their nascent phase, in their early stage, they were nowhere near the study of the rural agrarian society. If you look at the Western society when the sociology developed as a part of or as a study of the industrial society, urban society, the society absent of peasantry, that kind of phrases were used, and that way sociology in the nascent phase was not looking at the peasantry, the rural agrarian society, as it was more concerned with the study of the industrial society at the genesis source of the sociology. And social anthropology which developed, which started romanticizing with the simpler societies, the tribal societies, it also somehow or other, like sociology, neglected the studies of the rural agrarian one, the peasantry. It was considered to be missed bag. Peasantry was considered to be missed bag. But outside the Western Europe, in the eastern, central periphery of Europe, we started looking at that how the studies on the rural agrarian society became important. And precisely in the third world countries, including India, which was predominantly rural agrarian societies, the studies on the rural agrarian society became one of the major occupation of the sociologists, and also all of those people who somehow or other, despite their differences in academic contour, they now started looking at the rural agrarian society. Today, due to the intersectionality, the interdisciplinary approach, the holistic study of the human society has emerged out. And particularly when we are looking at any subject, more precisely the sociology or even the social anthropology, it would not be completed, its development could not take place, unless and until we are talking about the rural agrarian society. And in this very perspective, you need to understand that how during the British time, the rural agrarian society was studied, that was more for the administrative, political administrative kind of dimensions. Post-independently, the desire to reconstruct the rural society or rural reconstruction, which got the priority, within which the village studies, the rural agrarian society found predominance. And today when we are talking about the rural urban kind of continuity, then one of the major unit of analysis has also been there in the rural agrarian society. It means this transition has to be understood by us. Earlier when we started looking at the rural and urban one, if I could quote Sorokin, Zimmerman, they basically tried to look at rural and urban as a dichotomous to one another. So the term that was popularized was rural-urban dichotomy. But more precisely with the work of Robert Redfield, we find about that how the rural and urban are not to be viewed as the two different ideal types or two different polar opposites. And thus opposite of the concept rural-urban dichotomy, the concept that was popularized, that came to prominence, was called rural-urban continuity. And in this very perspective, Robert Redfield, when looking at, he defined peasantry as a part culture, part society. He said that there is a similarity in peasantry of the world. And what that similarity is all about? That similarity is all about could be looked in terms of attachment to the land. And agriculture is a style of life. When you say agriculture is a style of life, then he says peasantry has not to be viewed in terms of isolation. Rather, peasantry has to be looked in terms of the part of the totality. And thus, the moment he focuses, it has to be viewed as a part of totality. The rural-urban continuum became the most important one. If you talk about Seligman, Professor Seligman, he describes peasantry as a system of production and consumption, land as a means for survival, a specific traditional culture, an elite class being exterior to it, but the elite class which seems to be exterior to it is also having a control on them. However, when we start looking at peasantry from the Marxist perspective, the Marxist perspective basically tried to look at peasantry as traditional in outlook. And if it is traditional in outlook, it basically lacks the revolutionary class consciousness. And in this very perspective, there is one scholar, Singh. Singh basically says that neither Marx nor any Marxist have tried to analyze peasantry in a class manner. When you come to the Indian context, I said that Indian village or Indian villages have survived the rise and fall of dynasties. And if they have survived the rise and fall of dynasties, then the changes have started coming up with the British conquest of India. So when we look at the earlier, we find about that how villages have been a part and parcel of the Indian society, and particularly in a sociological dimensions. The two prominent sociologists, or rather I will call Marxist, that is R.K. Mukherjee and A.R. Desai, they tried to popularize the peasant study, and they also tried to approach the peasant study with a methodological perspective. For example, if R.K. Mukherjee focused on conceptual categories of class, then Desai applied the historical dialectical method. Whereas Yogendra Singh focused on the categories of caste, class, family. Louis Dumont emphasized on caste, within which you will be finding about the popular concept of binary opposition, pure and impure, that you might have gone through, or you will be talking about that in a caste. Andre Bete particularly initiates a new theoretical reference by using the categories of caste, class and power. The Trinity model, similar to that of the Trinity model of Weber. Only difference is that we talked about in Weber in terms of class, status and party. Andre Bete is basically using in terms of class, caste, class and power. And he is popularizing certain concepts like ownership, control and use of land. Yet another perspective was provided in it by the Daniel Thorner. And Daniel Thorner said that we cannot study agrarian structure from the exterior framework, since it is the sum total of the ways in which each group operates in relation to one another. The ways in which each group operates in relation to one another. Thus he preferred the term proprietor, farmer and laborers, which in a vernacular language we talked about Malik, Kisan and Mazdoor. And in this very perspective, not only the studies of rural agrarian structure became important, but also the studies of the Indian village, which I just said that we have survived the rise and fall of dynasties. And even today when you talk about that urbanization has increased in India, but despite this I will not hesitate making a sentence that the major chunk of Indian population still lives in the villages. It still lives in the rural settings. And thus any one of us, either as a teacher of sociology or a student of sociology, we cannot develop a better holistic understanding of Indian society by neglecting the rural agrarian structure. it becomes one of the most important dimensions within which we will have to develop our sociological understanding of Indian society as a whole. Similar perspective here. Particularly when looking at the Indian village, which has been a part and parcel of the Indian society. And despite substantial increase in the urbanization process, the villages or the village in India is an important unit of social reality, and it still remains to be an important unit of the social reality of Indian society. Pre-British, the dynasties came, dynasties disappeared, new dynasties come down, new kingdoms came out, and that way historically Indian villages have been documented in a pre-British from there. Almost the entire population seems to be indulged in the process of cultivation. Though we need to remember that land belonged to the community in India, not to the king. And when we look at the ancient history, we will find about the king rarely intervened to the direct process of the villages. For which the village panchayats, the councils of builders that were already there, and in this very perspective, you in ancient history might have gone through during the Mauryas, Guptas, Chola kingdoms, self-reliance, you find about their villages. That way, that's why I am saying that when you are talking about the studies on Indian villages, historically it has been documented in a very great manner. However, this entire system, what we are talking about in a pre-British, right from the kingdoms and the dynasties, it witnessed a complete change, qualitative, quantitative change with the advent of Britishers. One, India became the colony of British Empire. Then how the administrative shift toward the study of the village or towards management of the village, that became the priority. And this transition has to be understood. That's why once again I am saying that when you are reading, just give one reading. When you are reading the questions which are coming out in terms of the villages, you just go through in terms of historical one, the pre-British one, British one and the post-British one. In a Indological perspective, we will be finding about the structuralist perspective of Louis Dumont, bringing up the modern structuralism into it. You will also be finding about the structural functionist perspective of Srinivas and others. S.C. Dubé's account of the Indian villages. Yogendra Singh's work on Chamukheda. And particularly after the independence, how the Ministry of Rural Development and the very concerns of the rural reconstruction that has started emerging out. So the moment you are focusing on, automatically you will be talking about the land reforms, community development, alright, impact of the market on the rural agrarian economy. So this way, in continuation you will be having the overall view of the Indian village. It's so true that in the British period, when we were a colony, there was an impact of the British sociological tradition, not only on the Indian village, but in the entire study of the Indian society. That was basically to help the British administrators. Post-independently, basically after the 1950s, we will start looking at, and more precisely if I say after the CDP, Community Development Program, the Ford Foundation which came into being. Through this we will be finding about a shift in a theoretical methodological perspective in the study of the village, in the study of the Indian rural agrarian structure, and from where we will be finding about the impact of the American tradition of sociology. Louis Dumas will bring about the impact of the French tradition of structuralism into this analysis. And post-60s, when the second generation Indian sociologists will be emerging out, they will be basically bringing the field view, they will be bringing the different kind of perspective in the not only in the study of Indian society, but also in terms of the studies of the Indian villages. In a British time, you have got the question in terms of Little Republic of Charles Metcalfe, Henry Mann, Powell and others. But Charles Metcalfe was the one who has basically used the term Little Republic for the villages. Self-made republic, such kind of questions which are coming out could be done from there. The civilizations come, civilizations go. The dynasties come, dynasties go. What remains is the self-sufficiency of the Indian village. So that way he is basically looking at Indian village as the little republic. And not they are only self-sufficient. They have their own system of governance, making them similar to that of the little republic. Self-contained, they are autonomous with the self-governing entities, no interference from the higher political authorities. Kings will come, kings will go, self-sufficiency will always be there. And that was basically in terms of the questions like Little Republic of Charles Metcalfe or self-made republic, that perspective will be coming out. But post-independently basically, other new shift in the studies of Indian villages started taking place. We refuted, the Indian sociologists refuted the idea of Indian village to be self-made republic. And a self-sufficiency kind of propositions which was propagated. It was basically argued that Indian villages are to be studied in a multidimensional perspective. Indian village has not to be studied in terms of composed of the different castes. Village in India basically depicts a cultural world. Therefore, what we need, that we now need to study Indian village as a social reality. And thus, a certain qualitative change in the studies of Indian villages will be coming from the works of M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubey, Yogendra Singh. You will also be looking at the Milton Singer, influenced by the Chicago tradition of Redfield, that Indian villages are not merely influenced by the great tradition, but they also influence the great traditions. So that way the two scholars in a little tradition and great traditions I will be talking about in terms of a change. That is the one perspective to look at the change in Indian society. And this question has been there to you. So you need to not only to talk about the Milton Singer, but also to talk about the work on Kisangari, Marriott. And that way the little and great traditions concepts will be clear. When we are looking at the Indian village basically from the perspective of M.N. Srinivas, that M.N. Srinivas is basically talking about the Indian village as a microcosm of the Indian society and civilization. Now look at the word, that anyone who is trying to approach the Indian tradition and civilization, the microcosm of the Indian tradition and civilization is the Indian village. It is a village which has retained the traditional composition of the Indian civilization. Village reflects social reality where individuals have a multiple identity, in which village identity is the most significant one. Srinivas also refutes the proposition of Indian village as being self-made republic proposed by Charles Metcalfe and others. Srinivas argues that Indian village are interrelated. There are provisions of inter-market systems, and the villages adjacent to one another not only interact but also displays similarities. So microcosm social reality, multiple identities through which we will be talking about. This very perspective of looking at Indian society by M.N. Srinivas is now carried forward in terms of S.C. Dubey as well. And who say that no village in India is completely autonomous. Rather, it is a unit of social structure. Thus, in Dubey's work, if at one hand we find the concerns of autonomous village and the notion of change, then on the other hand we find about village as a part of the social structure, in which the economic system of village is based on functional specialization, caste interdependence and occupation. S.C. Dubey also analyzed the changes taking place in Indian villages brought by the CDP, Community Development Program, which not only increased agricultural production, improvement in health, but also sanitation. This CDP, according to him, which was introduced in the villages, it basically brought a change, cultural change in the village life. F.G. Bailey is talking about that Indian village reflect the character of wider Indian society, and every village is related with a cultural uniqueness. But when you come to the works of A.R. Desai, then he says, A.R. Desai is saying that since colonization and precisely in the post-independence era, Indian village has witnessed a tremendous change. And in this very perspective, he is basically focusing on the transformations in terms of market economy, impact of the new technology, and the relations with the intermediaries. The class dynamics will be introduced, and that way the certain questions of M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubey, Little Republic or Self-Made Republic by Charles Metcalfe, Henry Maine and others, that would be done. But this is the new beginning within which we find about the study, sociological study, the sociological conceptual development in terms of the study of village that has started coming out. Today in the contemporary times, even the Indian villages have been part of the sociological analysis. The new works are taking place. And we are finding about a certain kind of transition that is taking place in terms of the Indian villages. The rural agrarian structure in the wake of the globalization. The consumerism, the impact of technologies, technological advancement in the modes of production, and the certain issues with the Indian villages, rural agrarian structure is dealing with. Right from the agricultural bills which were repealed by the government, that we will be talking about when we come to the peasant and farmers movement. But once again I am saying the entire second paper has to be read in a holistic perspective, and then we will have to basically place it within the broader framework of the units. For example, when we are talking about the transformation of Indian society, or even the modernization of Indian tradition, some perspective of the Indian village, rural agrarian society and its dynamics will come out. Then we will be finding about land reforms, we will be finding about post-independently the changes of the rural reconstruction, and still the new kind of visions which are going on. So sometimes the questions of the new programs and policies will come out. A smart city to smart villages concepts, such kind of questions will be coming to you. And once you have talked about the rural reconstruction and started the study of the village by developing the perspective of the pre-British, British and the post-British, in which we talked about the few names, M.N. Srinivas, S.C. Dubey, Yogendra Singh, F.G. Bailey, A.R. Desai. Now once you have developed this concept of the Indian village and the changes which have been brought in, the relation between the rural and urban kind of, then yet another perspective that has been a most important dimension, which is still, I always say this is still a topmost political question before every political parties, whosoever may come to the power. How to deal with the concerns with the land? What kind of programs to be initiated in terms of the land reform? That remains to be an acid test for every political structure in India. And a starting point, I said that when we are talking about the concerns of land, land never belonged to the king in India. It belonged to the community. And in the different historical periods, we find about a certain kind of the land grant system, right from the Guptas to the Harsas, and you might have gone through. But more or less, the king had no direct control on the land, within which we will also be talking about the debate between feudalism, semi-feudalism of Harvans Mukhya and R.S. Sharma. But any one of us, particularly in Indian sociology, whosoever is looking at the Indian agrarian structure, the issues of land reform will remain to be one of the most important dimensions. But this very perspective on the land changed quantitatively, qualitatively with the advent of the Britishers, which brought this qualitative, quantitative change, and more precisely with the introduction of the land tenure systems, that is Jamindari, Malwari and Rayatwari. We find about the certain broader changes taking place. And changes are there in terms of commercialization of agriculture, commodification of land, increasing control of estate, transferable property rights, emergence of intermediaries, begins turning to the tenants, and that way the structural changes, I repeat, and that way the structural changes started taking place. Minto Munro, you might have gone through in history. If I talk about Munro, while talking about the changes in Jamindari, Malwari and Rayatwari, he said these are the alien concept to the Indian psyche. And if they are the alien concept to the Indian psyche, then it was not known to the Indian society. In between the peasants and the state, we found about the certain intermediaries. And land became a commodity to be sold and bought in the market like any other commodity. Commercialization of agriculture started taking place. Increasing control of state on land started taking place, which was not the feature in a pre-British kind of perspective. And once the India got independence, the very concerns of land reform was addressed. Even during the National Freedom Movement, the concerns on the land was highlighted. Land belongs to the tillers, such kind of slogans had emerged out. So just after the independence, Kumarappa committee was constituted, which has to look after the land reforms. And in this very perspective, the certain structural changes toward the land reforms was initiated. And I always say that when we are looking at the post-independence era, just after the independence, a step to the land reform was one of the boldest steps of the government. Land reform is basically an institutional change, or land reform emerges as an institutional measure to address agrarian inequality, poverty, preservance of or pursuance of justice, democratization of village life, and most importantly to increase the productivity of the land. A committee was constituted under J.C. Kumarappa, and the committee observed that Indian land structure is characterized by parasitic rent-seeking intermediaries, different land revenues system are there, land being concentrated in the hands of the few, a high density of tenant cultivation, exploitative and expropriative production relations, characterize the Indian rural agrarian society. And thus the committee suggested a legislative effort to deal with such issues. And this legislative effort, which was suggested by the J.C. Kumarappa committee, it still remains to be the major approach of the government to the land reforms. All states empowered by 1949 constitutional or parliamentary rule initiated land reforms, which emerged as an institutional change directed toward altering the existing pattern of ownership, tenancy and management of land, favorable to small tillers. When I say institutional change, it means the two institutions, which are the most important one, while moving toward the process of land reform, is the abolition of jamindaris and abolition of intermediaries. So unless and until these institutions are addressed, a major changes in the land reform could not be initiated. And that's why I am saying that when they say land reform, simply say land reform is an institutional measure or change directed towards altering the existing pattern of ownership, tenancy and the management of land favorable to the small tillers. These are the objectives which we are talking about, in which redistribution of land will also be coming out. If the economists debated on the farm size productivity, then particularly in sociology pertaining to the land reforms, two perspectives emerged. The first perspective is called the institutional perspective, which basically talked about the radical reorganization of the land ownership. And it popularized the slogan that is land belongs to the tillers. It means an institutional perspective, radical change in the ownership pattern was favored. But parallel to this institutional one, a pragmatic perspective emerged out by raising a concern that do we have enough land to satisfy the aspirations of each and every landless laborers in the country? And if we do not have that much land to satisfy the aspirations of each and every landless one or small tillers, then what we need to do, that we need to basically modernize Indian agriculture. We need to introduce the new technologies rather than altering the ownership on land. Introduction of the modern technologies would basically be enhancing the productivity, which will be beneficial not only to the landowners but also to those who are working on that one. However, let me say that land or any concerns related to land in India is basically politico-administrative concept. I repeat, land or any concerns related to the land in India is a politico-administrative in nature. It is a political question in which most of the times, I am sorry to make this line, most of the times the technical, economic and social debates, they relegate behind, they are left out. And thus all the states empowered by the 1949 parliament or the constitutional rule, they enacted the land reforms. And if we could quote Daniel Thorner, who says that the country whose history is so documented, in a very short span of time, so many land reform acts that started emerging out. And thus, the land reform which was initiated, the acts which were enacted by the states, the earlier from there, 1950s from there, when the land reforms, 1955 when the Jamindari was abolished, you might have gone through in terms of the observation of Honorable Supreme Court that how abolition of Jamindari came in contravene with the right to property. You will finding about the change in a constitution, you might have gone through that one. So the four dimensions you need to remember in the land reform. The acts should basically be looked from the four classified dimensions. The tenancy reform acts, legalizing the tenancies, abolition of Intermediaries Act, Land Ceiling Act, which will be basically having the purpose of land distribution to or redistribution to the landless and the small tillers, and the consolidation of desperate land holdings, a small scattered one. So these are the four acts: tenancy, intermediaries, ceiling, and a small and a desperate act, the lands which needs to be consolidated. Though there are certain reservations, then when you look at the works of Hamza Alvi and others, will find about how the vestigial form of zamindari is still persisting in the Indian village. And in terms of the abolition of intermediaries, one of the slogans that has come out that was popularized at that time, you might be aware of, that not every I was dotted and not every Y was crossed, yet the act was enacted. When you write intermediaries, you will start with I and you will conclude with a Y. This is the spelling which you will be writing about. So not every I was dotted, spotted, not every Y was crossed, yet the act was done. It shows about the certain lacuna, not only in the Jamindari Abolition Act, but also in terms of this one. And particularly we find about that we will be having the certain hypothesis, if the certain questions on Naxalism and other comes out, one of the hypotheses there, that the failure of the land reforms also culminated in Naxalite movement. So that way the certain propositions will be looking at. One of the most violent pigeon movement in India post-independently. But the Jamindars, the Jamindari abolition, the Ceiling Acts and others, remember one concept, a structural differentiation but functional integration. It means through the process of Benami, a structural differentiation of land started taking place. The landlords, that the land should not be usurped, they distributed the land legally to the relatives, their sons. That was a structural fragmentation took place. But this structural fragmentation which legally took place was on a paper. What remained is the one who had a control on the larger piece of land. He remained to be the owner. That's why I am using that you talk about one of the lacunae in terms of Benami, because the land reforms will not be talking about Benami Transfer Act that was transferred, that was enacted in 2019. So somewhere this concern has always been there. So the lacunae would be there. And that lacunae still persists. So we will be talking about the causes of the failures, the very limited role of the states or the center, too many laws across the country, across the states, lack of proper implementation, inability to deal with the malafide transfer of land that we are talking about in terms of Benami, in which we talked about a structural differentiation and functional integration. In 2005 particularly, then you also need to talk about not only 2005, before this, if they look at the nature of questions, you find about that how from the 1991 when we marched toward the process of liberalization, a new kind of activism has started toward the land reform or the issues of the land, which is still continuing in terms of the Indian villages in contemporary times. The fear of liberalization, the entry of the private parties, these are still being debated. The formation of SEZ, EEZ, and that way the certain newer issues are emerging out. In 2005, basically to deal with the SEZ, Special Economic Zone Act, SEZA, the two programs were introduced, that is basically RTI, Right to Information, and right to employment in terms of Narega, which are now calling Manrega, that will be coming out. You also might be aware of that how in 2013, Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, LARR, was enacted, which was further amended in 2015, in which social impact assessment CR will emerge out. And thus in 2019, you will finding about that how the Benami Transfer Act was enacted. Now we are focusing on the digitization of the land records. But somewhere, the opening up of the market, opening up of the economy, and march toward the liberalized, globalized era has further intensified the debate on the land reform. Displacement, rehabilitation, quality of land, minuscule land holding, all are now being debated. The entry of the private parties, the minimum support price, these all are basically coming out within which you need to talk about. How to secure the tenancy of the tenants is still a prime concern. However, let me change and say that there is no denying the fact that land reform aimed at growth with equity, distributive socio-economic justice, redistribution of land to the landless, but the desired result could not be achieved, in which the politico-administrative will, lack of politico-administrative will, outdated law, malified transfer of land, most of the land redistributed were barren or unproductive. Such kind of factors you could pick up. And particularly when looking at the sociological works, A.R. Desai from the Marxist perspective is basically talking about the land reform has not yielded the desired result, what it was meant for. The further inequality has emerged out. And there is one scholar, Nalkam Madhisesia, he observes that the land reform was not implemented seriously, and it further increased inequality in the rural agrarian society. This view of Nalkam Madhisesia has been supported by Walter Fernandez. So that with the land reforms, village studies that we will be talking about. I doubt whether they are asking with the questions on CDP 1952 when the Community Development Program was initiated. It was not a program, rather it was a method. And in this very perspective, you will finding about that how in 1948, basically, a pilot survey was introduced in the districts of Etawah and Gorakhpur, success of which culminated into a wider umbrella program that is called Community Development Program, with the objective of rural reorganization with the community participation. Before the launch of this one, there has been an observation of Taylor et al. Et al. Means more than one scholar. And I quote one line of them, one quote of them, that prior to the launch of CDP, the Taylor et al. Observed that poverty was rampant in India, per capita income was very less, people were dying of starvation, agriculture was stagnant, majority of population was illiterate. Thus, unless village reorientation was introduced, development of rural India could not have become possible. And in this very perspective, particularly in terms of the rural reorganization with the community participation, in 1952, the Rural Development Program was introduced. Sociologically speaking, CDP should not be viewed as a program. Rather, it should be viewed as a method. And when it's viewed as a method, it is having an ideology and a structure. As an ideology, it basically targeted to make people aware of their responsibilities. And as a structure, it basically targeted at interconnectivity between the different areas of the rural life. And thus, you can substantiate your view with the works, certain works. Like when A.R. Desai says that CDP is a method, through which 5-year plans were initiated to transform the socio-economic life of the villages. R.N. Raina argued that CDP tried to change all aspects of village life, irrespective of caste, religion and economic differences. Hammersfield comments that the aim of this project was not only to provide the basic amenities to the villages, but also bring change in the idea and the attitude, since unless the people could realize that they have potential to grow, success cannot be achieved. CDP as a structure also tried to relate the different interconnectivity, in which we will be finding about the network between the center, state, district, block, village. And to be very broadly, we will say, but if you look at all the programs, the implementation policies in which you talk about in terms of sociology, you also go in terms of second paper GS. You find about this is the same structure: center, state, district, block, village. That connectivity, network of connectivity has always been there in most of the programs, which we introduce, BDO, block development officer, that kind of posts started coming out. However, we also need to know that the kind of success which we had basically anticipated out of the CDP was not achieved. Why the rural reconstruction programs derailed, for which B.R. Mehta committee was constituted. And I quote one line of B.R. Mehta committee. He said that committee observed that unless at the village level there would be an institution which could take up the responsibility of administration and development, programs of rural construction would not become possible. Most of the programs would derail. And thus, from there you link it with the Panchayat Raj 1959 from their PRIs. So in which the B.R. Mehta committee 3-tier system would be coming out. When we are looking at the newer perspective within which, particularly in the late 60s, one of the issues in the transformation of the Indian rural agrarian structure would be basically the Green Revolution. As such, what Green Revolution has basically brought, there is a passing reference has to be talked by you. There could be a question, do we need yet another Green Revolution? Such kind of questions could be there. But let me say that your major focus should be on terms of the few scholars analyzing the social consequences of the Green Revolution. We do not find uniformity in the Indian sociologists and their views. And when I say we do not find this uniformity, it is only because of this fact that some have basically viewed the impact of Green Revolution positively. Then some have been looked at it from the more critical perspective. And the certain kind of consequences it brought which were not anticipated, that was basically focused on. In the mid-late 60s, Green Revolution was basically introduced to bring about the fundamental changes in Indian agriculture production with the help of the new technologies and HYVs, high yield variety seeds. This Green Revolution, introduction of Green Revolution basically transformed the nature of Indian agriculture. It had transformed the perspective of production, Indian agriculture production. From the subsistence, it moved to the surplus. So Green Revolution basically made Indian agriculture transform from the level of subsistence to surplus, thereby making Indian agriculture self-reliant and important contributor to the national economy. When we are looking at the post-Green Revolution scenario, reliance on monsoon, traditional ways of cultivation, low yield of the seeds, shortage of grains, poor quality seeds, lack of proper irrigation, lack of technological use, They were the certain kind of major hurdles with which the Indian agriculture was dealing with. It means in this condition, a new agricultural policy was required, which could basically address such kind of hurdles what the Indian agriculture was facing to. And in this very perspective, the use of technologies, the new methods of cultivations, credit systems, high yield variety seeds, all were introduced by the government to enhance the productivity of agriculture. And in this very perspective, A.R. Desai says that if you are looking at the Green Revolution basically produced a new dynamism in the technological innovation in Indian agriculture. It is true that somehow when we look at the Green Revolution, it was basically to enhance the productivity in all the grains. But it has more success in the wheat. And then you will be talking about, if that nature of question is there, that how during the mid-70s we find about the innovations or certain breakthrough in a paddy cultivation, and then we find about that how in 80s we find about in terms of coarse grains. So that way the certain phase-wise introduction of HYVs we will be looking at. And once it is started, Green Revolution basically brought the new transformative dimension in the Indian villages or Indian agriculture and its production. It was obvious that all those sociologists who were basically studying the rural agrarian structure, they will now be turning their attention to the study of Indian village or Indian rural agrarian structure. Thus the sociologists also turned their attention to analyze the social consequences of Green Revolution. But I said that when you are looking at the sociological work, the sociological fraternity does not seem to be unified. Rather it is divided. A good number of works for one hand have focused on the positive outcomes. Then a critical analysis has also been provided by the sociologists. I quote few so that you will be able to recall back. The first ideology which highlighted that Green Revolution has improved the economic conditions of the farmers and has also improved the level of employment in rural areas. Zamencher comments that due to Green Revolution, commercial farming has begun in India. Ashok Rudra observes that due to increasing agricultural production, markets have developed and development of the markets, Ashok Rudra says, would somehow or other would basically curtail the rural migration or the migration from rural to the urban areas. Even Andhra Beti talks about the concept of progressive farmers emerging due to the Green Revolution. Though TK Woman is talking about the organized movements of the farmers and how the poor peasantry has not been benefited. So if at one hand you pick up one or two scholars to talk about the positive consequences, the second ideology which was more critically tried to analyze the Green Revolution and its social consequences. One of the work which we always know is the Usha Patnaik. Through the Marxist perspective, she tries to analyze this one, that how the rich peasants who had control on large cultivable land became more successful by using new technology and bringing their products to the market in comparison to the poor peasantry, small and marginal farmers. And thus mind the word. So Usha Patnaik is basically focusing on the emergence of class inequality due to the Green Revolution. Frankel Fensin that argues that despite growth in a food production, quality of life did not improve. Now look at the dichotomy. At one end we are saying that we are moving from surplus to surplus in terms of grains production. But has it led to the improvement in the quality of life? Frankel Fensin saying no. Despite growth in a production, the quality of life of people have not changed. Indian agriculture became the self-reliant in food production, but could not achieve the target of social justice, which makes Daniel Thorner to comment that in a socialist India, Green Revolution initiated a capitalist economy. In a socialist India, there has been a march of capitalist one, Daniel Thorner is coming out, and that is there in terms of which was brought by the Green Revolution. Sacha Singh Gill, Ranjit Singh Ghemo, they have also talked about the Green Revolution, that how the capitalist agricultural began in India, leading to the blockage of surplus, and how Green Revolution has increased the disparity among the classes. Lack of technology in the agriculture and accessibility of the technology by majority of the peasants have not benefited everyone equally. The very concerns of social justice has not been equitable. Fruits of technological advancement have not been possible. And thus we are finding about that how today we are focusing on how the new use of technologies has basically talked about the automation, mechanization of in agriculture. That way there has been a curtailing of the unemployment. And in this very perspective, you basically need to talk about the social consequences. But when they ask you the questions on Green Revolution and the social consequences, talk about all this, both the ideologies, from positive to the critical negative kind of perspective. And then today that how we are now basically talking about the second Green Revolution, aim to bring change in agriculture production in terms of not only the food security, but also tackling the rise in food prices. Today in a Green Revolution, seeds with improved genetics, double cropping have been introduced. And in this, talk about that what the government initiatives are there. Krishi Unnati System Yojana with the Green Revolution scheme. Alright. Well, I hardly feel such kind of questions over there, but if you remember Krishi Unnati Yojana, within the understanding of the Green Revolution, you will finding about the certain initiatives. And that way you also talked about that the Green Revolution would not be having its desired result unless and until this class inequality, other kind of perspective that has come out. And you also raised the concerns on the food security, like availability of the food, account or accessibility on the food, affordability of the food. You could also relate this one in terms of the hunger and others. So all aspects of this has to be talked about. So these were the certain new changes, if they ask you, that has to be talked about. Otherwise you just give the passing reference in terms of that these are the new concerns which have been there in a Green Revolution. Yet another important area which has to be approached with the sociological work and the perspective is basically changing mode of in agriculture. Just give me 2 minutes, I'll come and I'll begin. अच्छा एक दो लोग आए थे ऑफलाइन, मैंने बोला कि भाई ऑनलाइन जाओ, आके टाइम नहीं बर्बाद करो. It's too hot. I don't know when we'll be having the respite in terms of the rain. Now let's resume in terms of the changing mode of agriculture. Let me say that it is one of the most, or is yet another important themes among the Indian sociologists who have turned their attention to the study of rural agrarian structure. Traditionally, we just talked about that how Indian agriculture relied more on the natural manure, on a monsoon, simple technology, bullock. But basically after the Green Revolution, some of the fundamental changes that started taking place in agriculture, which is still continuing there. Now when we are comparing the Indian agriculture and its conditions, we have been finding about the fundamental changes, not only in terms of the structural dimensions, the patterns of cropping, the use of technology, but we are also witnessing the changes in the attitude of the farmers as well. And in this very perspective, the science and technology, high yield variety seeds and its introduction of machines, change in the policies formulation of the government, and more precisely the restructuring of the rural agrarian structure by the efforts of the successive governments have initiated more positive outcomes. The scenario is changed here. In a British one, in terms of the pre-British one, and 2 or 3 phases, 2 decades, and particularly from the 67 and others when you start talking about the Green Revolution, and when we are looking at the changes in agriculture basically in terms of the post 1991, and now we are looking at in terms of the intensified globalized period, there is no denying the fact that not only quantitative but the qualitative changes, transformation has taken place in agriculture. The mode of production has witnessed a change. These all kind of policies, formulation, introduction of the technologies, change in the outlook of the government, successive governments. This is basically called the administrative approach in the changing mode of production in agriculture. In the administrative approach, we basically focused on the size of land, land holdings versus the land productivity, class and the regional inequalities. And basically in administrative approach, one of the major work has been by the Anand Chakravarti, who remarks that we need to focus on productivity of land rather than size of the land holdings. Do not focus on land holding. How much is the productivity of the land? That has to be basically targeted by the government. Yet another approach which emerged in the changing mode of Indian agriculture is called the cultural approach. That how economic ranking is affected by the cultural perspective, in which the Louis Dumont focused on the binary opposition of pure and impure. Andhra Bete has another observation. Andhra Bete says that people divide the social universe not only on caste lines but also on economic and political lines, and thus the caste, class and power perspective will be highlighted by Andhra Bete. F.G. Bele is talking that how the caste identity, that Indian culture basically reflects the caste identity, but there has emerged an inequality in terms of transformation from the caste identity to the class interest. I repeat, caste identity to the class interest. This is the second perspective. And you will be also using the third perspective, that is called the Marxist approach, highlighting the bipolar dichotomy or category of honor of the land and honor of the labor, within which commodification of labor, surplus value, exploitation, expropriation, all will be analyzed. The new land tenure system introduced by the colonial one, how they have basically brought the qualitative changes, within which the debate on the feudalism, semi-feudalism will be coming out. But since these tenure systems have been addressed, zamindari has been abolished, intermediaries has been there, and we find about it how the changes that is taking place. But in the same perspective, the Marxist one will also need to talk about the feudalistic orientation, and thus we will be talking about it how the new land tenure system has basically brought a certain kind of nature of the feudalistic orientation. And even today this feudalistic orientation is continuing. However, when we are looking at the work of Amit Biduri, then he is saying that Indian agriculture cannot be attributed as feudalistic, since the developmental activities introduced by the government have also increased the value of the small marginalized farmers, thereby preventing the class polarization. But contrary to the views of Amit Biduri, Ashok Rudra comes out, who writes that big cultivators have succeeded in usurping the land of small and marginal farmers, consequently giving way to the class polarization. The scholars like Daniel Thorner, which we talked about, Socialist India has marched with the caprice one, Frankel Francine, growth in the food production but not improvement in the quality of life, the issues of social justice. Sacha Singh, Gemo and Ranjit Singh Gill, highlighting the capitalist approach in the Indian agriculture that we just talked about in terms of Green Revolution. Even Kathleen Gough, with her work on the Kumbipitai village in Tanjore, she observes that a good number of villages are using the agriculture for industrial mobility. Though Dipankar Gupta, the contemporary sociologist, that he argues that capitalist agriculture is not a complete reality, since the demographic pressure has produced fragmentation on land, thereby resulting into the emergence of bourgeois class in India, restricting the emergence of bourgeois class in India. Let me quote the line that Dipankar Gupta argues that capitalist agriculture is not a complete reality, since the demographic pressure has produced fragmentation of land, thereby restricting the emergence of bourgeois class in India or in Indian agriculture. And thus N.K. Raj coined the phrase part capitalist society. Yet another approach that was highlighted by K.L. Sharma, who basically brings about the multi-dimensional approach and argues that in different times, different modes of production were prevalent in agriculture. The welfarist perspective of the government aimed to bring socialist orientation has brought mixed economy. Therefore, we need to take a note of all approaches while analyzing changing mode of production of Indian agriculture. If during 50s and 60s, most of the sociological works were concerned with the development and dichotomies produced by development, then in the 60s, we basically brought the indigenization perspective in Indian sociology to understand the changes. And in post-90s, opening up the economy and march towards globalized economy, that was highlighted. So today, the focus is on the changing role of the government, rollback a state versus the bring the state in debate, expansion of market, issues of MSPs, contract farming, agro businesses, questions on subsidies, waive off of the debts, bills. These all are the certain perspective in which the changing mode of Indian agriculture or production of Indian agriculture that has to be talked about. It means broadly you just try to talk about in terms of administrative approach, cultural approach, Marxist approach, within which we will be talking about the feudalistic orientation, capitalist approach, multi-dimensional approach. These are the 5 approaches through which this changing mode of production in agriculture that has to be talked by you. And if you look at the nature of questions, if they are asked you the certain impact of globalization and others, bring it. And while talking about the economy, work and economic life, I talked about that how the impact of globalization has to be looked in terms of economic, social and cultural kind of one. So you bring about the certain dimensions from there and look at the certain issues of disenchantment of the farmers. A very rarely, very old kind of questions were there in terms of in a Indian agrarian structure, rural agrarian structure, were the questions on Jajmani, which now we are not being asked. And particularly in the studies of the Indian villages and the caste system, particularly in the rural agrarian structure, Jajmani system and its analysis has been an important unit reflecting the feature of traditional socio-cultural system. Jajmani system is basically a Jajman-client relationship, reflecting the caste interdependence in which the caste which receives service is called Jajman and the caste which provides service is called Kamins. It means we are now basically focusing on the interdependence between the caste, the reciprocal relationship between the castes, and how this has basically leading to the functional interdependence between the castes that has been talked about. The system was prevalent in various parts of the country and the different terms were basically used. However, with the publication of Hindu Jajmani system by W.H. Weiser with his work on the Karimpur village in UP. A more generic term, Jajmani system, that has started emerging out, and since then we have been using this generic term, Jajmani system. Sociological we are talking about in the Jajmani system, study of Jajmani system. Can I ask you to use Durkheim's organic metaphor? Similarity between dissimilars between the caste which are talking about the different occupations. You talk about the Talcott Parsons interaction between the various actors, goal-oriented actors, goal-seeker actors. You also could bring about the Marxist perspective in terms of exploitation of come-ins by the judgments, how the commodification of labor is emerging out. Yet another perspective that could be used in terms of the symbolic interactionism, that how the change in the interaction between the caste is also bringing about the change in the system of Jajmani. So interaction pattern between the various castes, that could be applied. So Durkheim, Parsons, Marx, symbolic interaction, such kind of theoretical perspectives could be used, which we have brought from the first paper, which we are aware of while talking about the thinkers. Jajmani system broadly, very briefly we are talking about, it basically reflected the feudalistic and pre-capitalist orientation. And it basically talked about the immobility of labor and a capital from the village. Though primarily it has a base on the economic organization and exchanges, in which the initial mode of payment was barter system, then how this barter system gave way to the money transactions, and that way the certain changes started taking place. That means the Kamins started favoring those judgments who could pay them in cash rather than in kind. And we also need to remember that when we are talking about the Jajmani system having its base in the economic perspective, then it has its link with the social, it has a link with the cultural, it has a link with the political, every other kind of dimensions. The Jajman-Kamin relationship, that cannot be broken. It is not simply, it has to be related with the kinship as well. It is not simply the relationship between the two individuals. Rather, it is a relationship between the two patrilineages, in which the caste, kinship, socio-economic security will be highlighted. Particular two works, Yogendra Singh and B.S. Cohen, have brought a certain new dimensions in the study of Jajmani system. B.S. Cohen is talking about how the Kamin rights were sold. Unless and until you have arranged an alternative, this relationship cannot be broken. But Cohen is basically picking up the perspective from the Kamin's dimension. When Yogendra Singh observes in Chamukheda, he says not only the Kamins, but even the Jajman cannot leave the Kamins in a lurch. And that way the certain functional interdependence which I are talking about, in which unless and until you have arranged an alternative, that who will be doing your work, that cannot be broken. Jajmani system is also can be used to quote that how the prevalence of Jajmani system in a rural agrarian structure demystifies the phrase self-made republic of Indian village, because not necessarily Jajman and Kamins would be from the same village, they may come from the different villages. However, the opening of the market, process of monetization, urbanization, industrialization, increasing geographical mobility, occupational diversification, welfare policies of the government, laws and regulations affected the functioning of Jajmani system. Though two works, two sociological observations. One work is by Rauti Karve and Y.B. Damle on Maharashtra, and another work by the Bose and Jodha. They have observed on Rajasthan. They basically reveal that till date a good number of respondents recognize the socio-economic significance and security of that system. In the same perspective, we are talking about the functional interdependence. You can also talk about how if it is the relationship with the two patrilineages and others. Somehow they will try to have a link With yet another perspective, sometimes the short notes comes in terms of bonded labor, in which we'll be talking about the Article 23, Begar, abolition of Begar. So we talk about that how exploitation of the men by men resulting into master-slave, creditor-debtor relationship has been a reality in the world scenario. So we try to look at it in terms of the sequence, in terms of the bonded labor. Then how this exploitation is coming out, creditor and debtor, master and the slaves relationship. Though it is true that slavery has been abolished, but ironically in Indian society, the bonded labor exists, reflecting socio-economic inequality surrounded by the caste system. The system of bonded labor has not only sustained through centuries, but is continuing since generations to generation. Thus the sociologists are of the view that no society in the world seems to be as burdened by the reminiscence of material deprivation of the past as is India. I repeat, the sociologists are of the view that no society in the world seems to be as burdened by the reminiscence of material deprivation of the past as is India. In this context, the analysis of debt bondage seems important. It is referred by the different terms. You will not be able to so many names. The Jita in Himachal Pradesh, Sevak and Haris in UP, Kamin or Baramasiya in Bihar, Hali in Gujarat, Halia or Mulia in Odisha, Podigal in TN. These are so factual kind of perspective. Post-independently, we find about that how Article 23, that it basically constitutionally address this bonded labor, the abolition of begars and others. Even the Bonded Labor Act, System Exploitation Act was enacted. But ironically, in some parts of the country, it still continues, particularly in the green states like Punjab, Haryana, from where trapped and forced labor have been reported. One of the observations has been by the Nadeem Hasnan sir, that Nadeem Hasnan have reported from the Koltab bonded labor of Dehradun, Tehri and Girwal region, Uttarkasi. He reveals that Kolta being untouchables were barred by the traditional custom from owning land and even touching gold. And thus, this vulnerability makes them survive only on their own labor. And in any economic crisis, they are left with nothing but to mortgage their own body, which continues in generations. So that way, through the Nadeem Hasnan, you can just continue that one in terms of the Tehri Girwal, Uttarkasi and others. You also try to bring in your same understanding the agrarian class structure. All right. कुछ वर्क्स याद कर लेना भाई डेनियल थॉर्नर अभी मैंने बोला आपको मालिक किसान मजदूर आंध्रे बेते. All right. So that way from the part B unit 4 where the classes in India that I'll be talking about in terms of the certain theoretical debate, structuralist, structural functionalist, structural Marxist, modernistic. So that was a certain debate between caste and class relationship in India that has been addressed. Sociologically, talking about the theoretical methodological perspective. But what I am saying that when you are looking at most of the units of the second paper, this seems to be so interrelated that you basically need to look at the syllabus and just try to mentally make up the structure. That when you started talking about the rural agrarian society, which was a part of the social structure in a society, when you come to the part C, you need change, then the transformation of rural agrarian come out, and this transformation could also be viewed in terms of the movements in which we will be talking about the peasant and the farmer movement. When you are talking about the conditions of farmers and the peasants, you will also be talking about part C, 7A, in which the displacement and other issues will be coming out. When we are talking about the part B unit 4 in a class structure, you find about that how agricultural class structure has been taught to you. So that way you bring about the certain kind of works, and that way the understanding could be developed in terms of DN Dhanagre. Such kind of questions are coming out, that how we will be looking at that one. And then one of the important dimensions that has to be talked about from where your certain programs, policies, your understanding will be coming out in. This is basically called poverty, inequality, exclusion and the rural development. which we will be using in terms of transformation and others, the newer kind of data that has to come on, event data that has come out. So you talk about that how in Asia for the first time the poverty has decreased, and in which the contribution of India has been the most important one. So that way you just try to substantiate your view with a new kind of perspective which you might have gone through in the GS. Relate this one with also in terms of the poverty, inequality, exclusion with the types of the social stratification, or with the unit of the social stratification, unit 5. And if I say that when we are talking about the sociological narratives, and more precisely in the analysis of the social stratification, yet another dimension, one of the most important dimensions that will be coming out is the poverty and exclusion. Almost in every organized society, there has been a presence of a category which has been placed lowly, manifesting the perspective of institutionalized inequality. An outcome of this institutionalized inequality would lead to the socio-economic exclusion of one category by the another, who will sustain the deprivation. And thus, sociology in general and rural sociology in particular will be concerned of the studies on the poverty. And poverty has been a social concern, it is still a social concern. I always say that how the society views poverty, that matters. As the society views poverty, so the redressal mechanism will also be varying, the categorization of poverty will also be varying. So poverty is basically social concerns. And right since the 19th century, when the rigorous works on the poverty started taking place, the researchers basically tried to develop a fixed yardstick to measure the poverty. And this fixed yardstick would be applicable to the entire society, all. And thus, what I develop is basically called the concept of poverty line, below which the poverty begins, above it the poverty ends. So you might have gone through in economics, you might have gone through in your GS, and within which we talked about the two types, absolute and the relative poverty. Alright. And once we talked about them, sociologically, apart from the relative and absolute poverty, yet another perspective that was basically, yet another concept that was basically added is called the subjective poverty. That how the people of group, they consider themselves to be poor or not, that kind of perspective that has started coming out. In the 80s, most precisely in the writings of the French scholars, the term social exclusion was highlighted instead of poverty. And that also led to the debate between the materialistic deprivation versus multiple deprivation. But today the way the MPI concept has emerged out, multidimensional poverty, you find about this very debate between material and multiple one, that it has not merely to be viewed from the materialistic or economic deprivation, but the social dimensions also becoming important. That way, the certain studies, certain yardsticks and certain conceptual dimensions will become clear to you. And when I am looking at the sociological works, the earliest and the most classical work has been by Charles Booth, who suggested that practical programs and reforms and welfare policies for the drastic reduction of poverty. Scott focused on the fulfillment of physical needs. And he talked about the cultural needs like reduction, security, recreation. It means now we are talking about the earlier kind of works, sociological works, in which if we talk about the Smith and Townsend, they argue about how society defines poverty, that matters. The constant evolution of researches in poverty have basically introspected a move to move away from calories or income approach, how the calories and nutritional de-link was emphasized. It was also read that how the essential non-food items are being ignored, like rent, fuel, education, health. And in this very perspective, you basically need to look at the certain newer kind of perspective, that why the MPI became the important, such kind of questions could be there. either in terms of sociology or it could also be raised in terms of the GS paper 2. And so that way, you just talked about that how the multidimensionality is there, that you do not have to understand poverty unidimensionally, rather it has to be viewed multidimensionally. And thus, in the 2010, the concept of MPI that is emerged with the indicator of education, health, standard of living, there could also be question which has been GS, there could also be question in sociology that how time has come to move away from the income approach. So we'll be talking about the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen, we'll be talking about some other approaches. So how from shift from the income approach is coming out. So that could be at another perspective which you might have gone through in a poverty. Sociologically, the work of Richard Silver analyzed poverty as a feedback system in terms of vicious circle theory of poverty, implying that various circumstances of the poor maintain poverty, and thus poor are trapped in a situation with a very little chance to escape. And when you talked about the concept of Richard Silver and the vicious circle theory, that how poor are trapped and they do not have a much chance to escape this one. Then you also talk about the Oscar Lewis with his work on Mexico and Puerto Rico, proposed the concept of culture of poverty, a design for living transmitted from generation to generation. And in the classical sociology, Marx talked about the process of pauperization, whereas Weber related poverty with the market situation. However, Herbert J. Jens, he provided the functionist perspective to the study of poverty, and he argued that poverty survives in parts because it is useful to number of goods in society. It benefits the non-poor in general and rich and powerful in particular, as the poor provides low-wage labor and they are ready to perform any kind of dirty works. Poverty in a sociological analysis was also linked to the social exclusion, reflecting deprivation, inequality and being away from the mainstream. In almost every works on poverty, I just said that in particular in the 80s we find about that how the term social exclusion instead of poverty was used by the French scholars. So there in terms of social exclusion you talk about, David Bain argues that the term social exclusion has replaced the term underclass. Though Charles Moore argues that underclass socially exclude themselves. As a question, such kind of questions have come out, that they were excluded and they excluded themselves. So here you can pick up in terms of social stratification, link it. So though we are talking about social exclusion, poverty, inequality and the rural development, so from the transformation of the Indian rural agrarian society. So Charles Moore argues that underclass socially exclude themselves by not participating fully in the society. Even in the Indian context or Indian society, poverty is witnessed primarily among the Dalits who have been excluded socially by the caste ideology, but today they socially exclude themselves by not considering themselves to be a part of the Hindu society. Thus sociologically we need to understand the difference between socially excluded and those who exclude themselves socially, which broadly encapsulates race, ethnicity, caste, class, gender, poverty. Is take this data to the social stratification, this interrelationship has to be there, particularly post-independently. With works of the various committees try to address the concerns of poverty, and over the decades they have shifted their focus from calories to the purchasing power parity to the income to now we are talking about the MPI. And basically the last few decades have shown that how there has occurred a reduction in the poverty. So you pick up the Rangarajan committee, you might be aware of from recently, we will be talking about that one. Alright, I don't know whether you have the sequence right from the B.S. Minhas committee to the Rangarajan committee, the certain 8 or 9 committees will be coming out. So in economics, anyone who could have done the economics, you might have gone through, or you just can remember few, Tendulkar and others, Rangarajan committee, so that the real contemporary changes could be understood by you. They are always the passing reference here. Facts will always find the locations in the concepts. And once you have done this one, then you talk about that how today in the every 5-year plans, particularly till the 12th 5-year plan, certain concerns of poverty has always been a major preoccupation of the governments. And after the 12th 5-year plan, which has been replaced by the Niti Ayog, so the Niti Ayog vision in which the poverty has been there. Look at the certain programs which the government has introduced to address the poverty. If I make a line, a broader generalizing line, which we as a teacher in sociology always say to the student that you do not have to have that very broader generalizations. But when we are talking about the Indian society in terms of the rural and urban, can I say that most of the people who are poor, they live in the rural areas. And thus, right since independence, rural reorganization or rural reconstruction was highlighted. And thus, within which the poverty, deprivation, inequality, hunger, starvation, and then the reduction in such kind of issues, enamel is prevalent in the rural agrarian structure. That has been a prime concern, that has been a prime target of almost all the successive governments, and which the Ministry of Rural Development was constituted. Remember this line when you say that what is the rural development? Rural development is conceptually a broad inclusive term, including within itself the social, economic and political development of the rural areas. Though you also need to remember that there are no universally accepted approach to rural development. Rather, rural development is a choice influenced by time, space and culture. I repeat that there is no universal definition or accepted approach to the rural development. It means now what will be the line which you remember? That rural development is a choice influenced by time, space and culture. It is a comprehensive or multi-dimensional concept encompassing itself, within itself, the development of agriculture, land reforms, development of villages, cottage industries, socio-economic infrastructure, thereby focusing on the integrated rural development, in which we basically need to talk about the interrelationship between various fields, various dimensions, that is physical, social, economic, political, educational and technological initiatives. Though it is also true that despite the reductions what the government statistics are coming out, what the UNDP has recently come out in terms of the great reduction of poverty in the Indian context, but this work also recognizes that post-COVID analysis has not been done. It means we are finding about that kind of things which you look at the UNDP report. So you find about it how in the from 2016 onwards we have found about that how the poverty has been reduced. Till date we are talking about, then we find about the poverty and hunger that persists in India, not denying the fact. Let's be very practical. Let's be very truth-seeking person. That despite the tremendous growth of the Indian society, despite the successive efforts of the different government, and whosoever the government has come out, with their own vision, they have basically tried to address such kind of issues, which have proved detrimental to the social growth. So poverty and hunger has been a prime concern. But despite this, let's accept this fact that poverty and hunger persists in India. And there is also persisting a regional disparity. This regional disparity has been basically focused by Das and Barua in India. Assis Bose coined the term Bimaru state, whereas Fernando reviewed domestic aspect of poverty, which he considered has been hit hard after liberalization policies. And then that how this has increased post-liberalization in Dalits, tribals and women. Though the recent UN data reveals that from 2005-06 to 2019-21, approximately 315 million people have been taken out of poverty, but irony being that the impact of COVID pandemic has not been introspected, which I just said it. As a matter of fact, the successive lockdowns, slowing of economy, closure of business activities has not only affected all classes, the rural and urban, but it has increased the incidences of poverty. That's what we need, that we need basically to focus on integrated development and particular rural areas within which employment of the youth, how to provide employability is the prime concern. Yogesh Atal is supporting holistic cultural specific approach, whereas Sachidanand favors the understanding of social reality before launching any rural development programs, whereas R.U. Ahmad favors increasing the role of NGOs and self-help groups in tackling with the poverty. So that way, the certain units which we are talking about, that would be talked about. So you just develop the concepts of peasantry, and we started in terms of, then you talk about the concept of Indian village, develop the land in terms of the land reform. That remains to be an acid test for every political structure in India. In terms of the land reform. That remains to be an acid test for every political structure in India. Jajmani system, CDP, and then this poverty, inequality, deprivation, and that way, almost I think the units would be done. Let me just see it, the syllabus, so that that could be done. The idea of Indian village studies, evolution of the land tenure system, land reforms, and then we are talking about the programs of rural development, community development program, poverty elevation schemes, green revolution, changing mode, bondage labor. So that way you just talk about, and you pick up these dimensions. Though I'll also be saying that please do give some time on the gender dimension, the feminist perspective, please bring it. And in this very perspective, can you focus on the concept feminization of agriculture? That could be one question that could be raised. So you just have the certain structural points, just structure the points in your mind and talk about the feminization of agriculture, that how it is encompassing the increasing participation of women in the agriculture sector. A trend particularly prominent in developing countries. This shift of feminization in agriculture would basically be talking about advancement in women's literacy, skill and awareness leading to expanded roles in a farm management and labor. Then globally, when we are looking at the feminization of agriculture, signifies greater movement of women in various aspects of agriculture production, distribution and value addition. And if talk about that, how from the economic survey from 17 and 18 we started talking about the feminization of the agriculture sector due to the growing shift, and that way you talk about the feminization of this sector. The phenomena is popularly a complex interplay of economic and socio-cultural forces, changing agriculture practices including mechanization and migration of males from the rural to the urban areas, so that the work has been there in terms of the women's. Suicides, you can also talk about the certain social factor of suicide, including mechanization and migration of male laborers to non-agriculture sector, have created opportunities for the women to step into the farming roles. Moreover, the government initiatives promoting women's participation in agriculture through credit facilities, subsidies, self-help groups, and the further incentives to increase their involvement in the process of agriculture. These you pick up. There is socio-culturally, there is a shift in the gender roles, greater awareness rising among the women of their rights, and improvement in education have all empowered the women to actively engage in agriculture activities. So we are basically now recognizing the women's contribution to agriculture. So pick up that one, feminization of agriculture and the increasing feminization, and talk about the certain effects suicide rate among the farmers, Tamil Nadu, Manipur, effects of economic and social incentives, increment, migration, social mobility, food insecurity, women's unfree labor, All right. And then I talk about this budget allocation or to increase the women's participation, the draft land reform policies 2013. I talk about Mahatma Gandhi rural employment guarantee schemes, National Rural Livelihood Mission, Syama Prasad Mukherjee Urban Mission. Such kind of programs we just talk about, so that you do accept or expect or anticipate a question from the feminization of agriculture. So this is the one unit that will be there, and most of the units after the thinkers would be the lesser one, so that the broader views will be talking about. But I'll ensure that when you watch the video, just please note down the scholars which I have talked about, so that these scholars could be used. And time and again tomorrow when we'll talking about industrialization, urbanization, is another unit which we don't enjoy, because most of the time we do not look at this one in industrial policies and other kind of perspective. But certain areas, urban poverty, slums, whatever will be coming up. Some sociological works I will be quoting, and so that way things will be much more easier in part of you to substantiate your views and provide the answer that making the examiner know that yes, you understand it is not, you are not writing in a journalistic perspective, you are not writing as if it is a GS paper. Rather, these are the questions which have been asked in sociology, and I understand what sociological perspectives are to be used, what concepts, what theoretical models are to be used, and that way raising the subjectivity of the teacher, so that you will be getting some extra marks. Alright, and that way things will be done. I told you that you are in safe hand, together we will do this one. But once again I am saying that just keep an eye on the use of theoretical and the conceptual clarity which you have developed in first paper. Keep an eye on the development of the theoretical methodological perspectives or approaches of the Indian sociology. And you also need to learn the art of substantiating your views as empirical sociological works in your answers. Alright? And how to be analytical and linear in your answer. So that way the things will be done, and this unit has been done, because usually in the course, the foundation course, I bring all the topics. Not only understanding of that one, but the transformation, talk about the rural agrarian structure, the class dimension, and then we also bring about the movements, displacement, alright, and caste conflict, so that everything is basically interrelated. But I just let them know that where we are using and in which way we are using. So since this is the one unit which I have to go through, so you go through this one, look at the perspective of the transformation, your major focus would be there. Village study would be one where from where the questions are coming up. So and keep an eye on the new changes, and so that you would be more comfortable to deal with. Thank you. In between, once again I am saying, in between, if you have any problem, just let me know. All right, don't hesitate. I am there for you, and then things will be done. Just listen the video, note down few of the things, and you might be aware of the new data which comes out. You just note it down and just try to incorporate in your understanding, in your notes, so that once when second time when you are looking at, you would be more comfortable and you will be able to remember that one. The things will be much more easier. All right, we'll meet you tomorrow. Thank you.